Just about every Christian church in the country has somehow the idea of disciple making in their mission statement. I know that was true for our church 20 plus years ago when we started the church. We talked about helping people pursue God. We talked about disciple making all the time. And then about 10 years in, we looked in the mirror and realized we weren't actually doing it. And that's what we're going to be talking about in this 3-part training series that we're just calling Pastor Training. In this series, we'll help you to learn how to create a culture where disciple makers are the rule, not the exception. In other words, where disciple making actually happens throughout your church. In this first lesson, we'll give you an introduction biblically to why it's so important strategically to go out and make disciples within the context of your church's ministries. And then in lesson number 2, we'll talk about the Pursue God picture and the process, and we'll really start to jump in the weeds. And then in the final lesson, we'll give you some essentials for every pastor if you really want to bring a discipleship culture to your church. Now, we've taken almost a decade to figure this out for ourselves as a church after having come back from a trip to the Philippines where we saw disciple making actually happening. I'm talking about a massive multi-site church, and yet when we lifted up the hood of the car, so to speak, the engine that was running this church was individuals making disciples in their own life, in the game, fully activated. So even though when we saw the church on a Sunday morning and we saw how they did worship and their teaching and it was so energetic, it looked on the outside like a typical megachurch, but really on the inside, they had a secret that we realized in our church that we didn't have. And so we came home from that trip to the Philippines and we started working on the resources at PursueGOD.org so that we could equip our church to start making disciples, and also so that we could help churches like yours to do the job as well. Now, we'll get into all of this as we get started here on lesson number 1, Intro to Pursue God Pastoral Ministry. And I want to start with this idea. Most churches today are broken. They're built to minister to crowds, but they leave individuals confused and helpless. Now, we see this in Jesus' very own ministry, Matthew chapter 9, in verse 35 and 36. It says that he traveled through all the towns and villages, and he was teaching in the synagogues, announcing the good news about the kingdom. It says that he healed every kind of disease and illness. But look at this. When he saw the crowds, he had compassion on them because they were confused and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. Now, doesn't this remind you just a little bit of the church in America? We've got great ministries attracting thousands of people in many of our churches on a Sunday morning, and we've got really good music and great media, great teaching, all these wonderful things. But if you're anything like me, you'll realize, just like Jesus does here in this passage, that many of those people go away confused and helpless. In other words, and I don't think this is a knock on any of our ministries, public ministries, when we preach, it turns out that it's just not quite enough. Jesus himself admitted it after preaching the good news. He recognized that individuals were still confused and helpless, and he identified them as sheep without a shepherd, even though Jesus is the good shepherd. That's because sermons which minister to crowds don't actually accomplish the ultimate goal of shepherding, which really is more of a personal thing. And that's why the biblical solution is empowerment. It's sending regular people into the world to actively make disciples. This is what we saw in the church in the Philippines, and it's what we started to implement in our own church. Back to Matthew chapter 9, Jesus turns and says to his disciples, "The harvest is great, but the workers are few. So pray to the Lord who is in charge of the harvest and ask him to send more workers into his field." And then Paul explains it this way later on in Ephesians chapter 4, starting in verse 11. He says, "These are the gifts that Christ gave to the church, the apostles, the prophets, the evangelists, the pastors and teachers." Think of that as the paid staff, the pastors. And he says this, their responsibility is to equip God's people to do his work and build up the church, the body of Christ. In other words, the church model that has pastors doing great public ministry up front, and there's nothing wrong with that. Sermons are still biblical and they're still good, but they were never intended to be the fix-all, right? We need more than just sermons. We need regular people, regular Christians in our churches to be empowered, to get in the game, and to go out and start making disciples. And the pastor's job then is to equip and empower the people to do the work of the ministry instead of just telling the people to invite their friends to come listen to a sermon. And look, when we can get the church functioning like this, the payoff is maturity for every believer and also a church that is growing and healthy. This is what Paul is getting at in Ephesians 4. In verse 13, he says, this will continue, regular people making disciples, this will continue until we all come to such unity in our faith and knowledge of God's Son, that we will be mature in the Lord, measuring up to the full and complete standard of Christ. In other words, maturity comes after people start making disciples. We don't have to wait for people to become super Christians before they're ready to go out and get in the game and start doing ministry. Individual Christians will grow and mature as we empower them to make disciples. But then together, corporately, in verse 16, it says that Christ makes the whole body fit together perfectly as each part does its own special work. In other words, pastors equip and empower, and the people do the work of the ministry. Turns out when we do this, then it helps all the other parts to grow so that, look, the whole body is healthy and growing and full of love. And this right here is what we saw in the church in the Philippines. Even though our church was large already, we were growing. Turns out we weren't healthy because we weren't empowering disciple makers like this church in the Philippines was doing. These guys were sending people out. It was the norm for people to be making disciples in their ministry. And this church was doubling in size every 5 years. In fact, the first time we visited this church, it had 35,000 attenders at their campuses throughout Metro Manila. And then the next time we came back, about 5 years later, they were over 70,000 people. What we saw was this passage in practice. A church that makes disciples is healthy and growing and full of love. And this is what we challenge you to pray for as you work through this series at PursueGOD.org. Now use those questions down below to talk about this. And in the next lesson, we'll talk some more about the picture and the process for Pursue God disciple making.